And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Yes, but excitingly, very excitingly, Daniel, on that note, we have been joined by Dr. Paula Boddington. Paula, it's great to see you. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, it's great to see you too. Thank you very much for having me on. I hope I haven't interrupted a critical discussion by...
No, not at all.
It's not an interruption, but it was certainly a deeply critical discussion.
We were just putting the Church of England to rights.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Paula, I heard on your interview with Jonathan Pajot that you turn your laptop round so that you yourself are facing in the direction geographically of the people or the person you're speaking to. So you were facing Canada when you were speaking to him. Now, are you doing that? Are you doing that today? And if so, who are you facing?
Well, you see, I couldn't do that because you're in different directions, aren't you? And I don't always do it, actually. I did it because I was talking to Jonathan about technology. It was at that point that I suddenly had a thought about it. And also the next day I was going to talk to, I used to live in Australia. So I was going to talk to people in Australia. And I think it's partly the pandemic and the feeling of being so far away from people that made me think about it. So I'm probably facing actually midway between both of you, because you're in Cornwall, aren't you, Daniel?
Devon,
Devon, yeah.
Plymouth-wise.
Same thing.
I'm probably like at the intersection. If you drew an angle, I'm probably facing there. So I could go like this.
Yeah. Well, that's probably the best. That's probably the best way. I think that's probably the best thing you can do from a geometrical point of view. But I'm sure we've got your absolute full focus on Zoom. So the technology is good for something, and we're not actually talking about technology today necessarily. But this is one of your areas of real interest, isn't it, Paula? In IT and I don't really know how you say it, but like technology and how it pertains to the future of humanity. It's one of your interests, isn't it?
Yes. Well, actually, so actually both in relation to what you might call. Technology is such a broad term, isn't it? What you might call medical technology. Right. So I've done a lot of work in relation to medical ethics, and including what you might call technology or developments in science, because I worked for a long time in issues related to clinical genetics and genomics. Yeah. But then for the last, I think I started in about 2015 when I was at Oxford. I started working on ethical issues in artificial intelligence.
Right.
Which is actually completely and utterly fascinating, actually.
Yeah.
I have to put up my hand here. So I'm fascinated by that too, and fascinated what you've said. I've also had time with Jonathan Pajot and interested in his journey, and Rod Dreher and others. Yeah. But I in the 80s did a computer science degree, and I've kept a fascination for AI, and then in theology did a lot of medical ethics. So it really resonated. Thank you for what you've contributed, I think, to that discussion. I ended up talking to my son last night about, I think, one of the interviews that you did with Pajot about the danger of us all becoming sort of social media worker bees.
Mm. Yes. Because actually a lot of the myth about AI, a lot of it's myth. It's very complex, but the pictures are, it's going to be like super robots, super intelligence, and AI is going to be cleverer than us. But if you look at the reality of it, a lot of it is people working in the Philippines doing content moderation for vile stuff on the internet. There's a lot of it is actually really appallingly paid, awful, repetitive work. Not at all some vision of great sort of leap forward of humanity.
Yeah, so it's like a new form of serfdom, isn't it? It's like a kind of technological serfdom. So people aren't, like mining cobalt out of the. Children aren't mining cobalt out of the sand with their bare hands, but people are sat in front of a screen, tapping on a keyboard, doing repetitive, mind-numbing tasks for no money.
Yes, and also, I mean, the computer technology that we're using is produced by people in China and places like that, working in terrible conditions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Picking up. So yeah.
So Paula, let's come to you, and then eventually to the issues that we're going to talk about today, because really we're going to hone in on this specific topic of medical ethics, and I think we're going to talk hopefully in a way which is interesting and insightful about the situation vis-a-vis the COVID vaccines and what's been said in the public sphere, and the intersection with the church. But I think it would be good to get a handle on who you are for people who don't know you. So you are, so for a start, you're a regular church attending Anglican.
Well, you got that, because I've got that. I said that I wrote an irate letter to Justin Welby that I sent you. When I say regular, it's not like it's not like I go every single Sunday. Some Sundays I go twice, and some Sundays I don't go. So.
Okay. Well, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, the word regular does a lot of work, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But that's just to say that that's your context. You're not coming at this from as an outsider or from an antagonistic position, but you are actually, you have an emotional and spiritual stake in this, because you are part of this church too, this church that we love and we want the best for. So we're starting from that perspective. Now let's talk about your professional qualifications and your experience. So do you want to just give us a broad introduction to who you are, and then maybe tell us a little bit about how your experience and your qualification relate to this issue of vaccination, and particularly with reference to the COVID-19 vaccines?
Okay, so a sort of a potted biography of my sort of academic background. I'm a philosopher. My first degree was in philosophy and psychology, but I was at an undergraduate at Keele, which at the time you did loads of mixed arts and science. So at school I mostly studied science, and then I think it's actually probably relevant. My main interest in philosophy was ethics, but I did a DPhil at Oxford on the topic of that was actually self-deception. And one of the reasons why I mentioned that is because it sounds like a really obtuse sort of abstract thing to be doing a philosophical degree on how people could deceive themselves. But it's actually been a really handy guide to life, because it's set me up for always thinking about how we form our beliefs and how we might think something's rational or irrational, and that's actually far too simplistic. So that I've worked in terms of, I've done a lot of work in applied ethics, both teaching and in research, so in medical ethics. So for example, I said this in my letter to Justin Welby, just to sort of, because I was actually rather furious and I wanted to sort of put it all on the line. I've worked for a while in the medical science division at Oxford University looking at ethical issues. I've worked at Cardiff University in relation to clinical genetics, and I work part-time with a team of people who do research into the hospital care of people with dementia. Right. But also I've also had this interest in new technologies. So I worked for a while in, I'm still working, I'm writing a textbook at the moment about AI ethics. I worked in the computer science department at Oxford University on a project for a while, funded by Elon Musk, actually.
Yeah.
Wow.
Great.
Oh.
Very cool.
Yeah, he has very interesting views on this, doesn't he?
Yes. I mean, he had nothing to do with, I don't think he had any influence about the work I was doing. In fact, I wrote a book from it, and at the end of it, I thought, well, since you funded the research, I should send him a copy of the book. And I couldn't even get a reply from any of his people or anything about where I might post it. There's no contact whatsoever. Wow. I'm too low down the food chain.
He's in some space station, geostationary orbit.
He's an amazing guy, isn't he? And now your official title at the moment is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Healthcare at the University of West London.
Yes.
Okay.
So what I'm talking about today is not to do with I'm working on a team. We're working on a research project. Various research projects trying to improve the care of people with dementia who are in hospital.
Right.
So, but I also work with a lot of medical sociologists.
Yeah.
So I think you can approach these issues from a very sort of medical ethics point of view. But when you start looking at the sorts of things that medical sociologists have to say about healthcare practices, it gives you a sort of more rounded view of some of the things where people might want to critique and try to improve what's actually going on in healthcare.
Yeah. Okay. Now, should we ask? Can I ask a kind of general question? Because basically, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about specifically the comments that the Archbishop of Canterbury made about encouraging people to get vaccinated and boosted. And your response, as you've said, you wrote a letter to him in which you took issue with a number of things that he said. I think it's fair to say. When we talk about medical ethics, just more generally, have you been concerned over the last 2 years about the way that medicine and science as concepts have functioned in the political sphere?
Well, yes, I have. I mean, there are so many ways in which I'm concerned about it. One of the things I want to say at the beginning, actually, is because one of the main ways in which I'm concerned about it is how society is being divided.
Yeah.
In terms of, so I'm concerned about a lot of the rhetoric. I think we need to look at what's going on in terms of the rhetoric, and I'm concerned about how notions in public health are being used in ways which I think are just a bit too crude. Yeah. I'm concerned about the ways in which people might be being coerced in various ways, but I'm really concerned about how people are being divided. So one of the things I want to say at the beginning, I mean, partly because there's so much rhetoric around about people being anti-vaxxers, including thinking that anybody who's skeptical in any way about the vaccine is an anti-vaxxer, and including the ways in which rhetoric are about, oh, follow the science or the science, when if you are a scientist, what you do is try to test and doubt, and that's following the science. That's a methodology to try to test what we know, not rather than uncritically believe it. But I mean, actually, so in conjunction with the work I'm doing on the hospital care of people with dementia, I've just been looking in the last couple of weeks at research about the impacts of loneliness. Yeah. So it's been known for some time that loneliness is one of the risk factors for developing dementia, but it's also known that loneliness, in terms of, there's one thing, number of social contacts, and the other thing is the feeling of being lonely, which is something separate. It actually can impact directly your cognition, in particular your emotional and social cognition. Yeah. And of course, that's one of the factors of the pandemic. So people have talked about how fear is dividing people, but just sheer loneliness itself. And there's been research on this, probably not enough research, but there's already research coming out about the impacts of the pandemic. So yesterday I read a paper that came out last year, which was looking at loneliness, its impact on how we related to other people, just from the first 20 days of lockdown, when it was 3 weeks to flatten the curve. And in those 20 days, the people who felt most lonely, it leads you to interpret faces more negatively. So you're more likely to see them as hostile or as a threat. And it leads you to be less cooperative. You know, they do tests with little online games. So one of the things I want to stress is that means when we're all, not all of us, but there's a tendency in society to think, oh, the other side are trying to force me to be vaccinated. Oh, the other side are anti-vaxxers. So I just really, and everybody knows that there are families ripped apart by stances on this. So one of the first things I want to say is that I just want to think, try to get away from.
Isn't it interesting that there was this low resolution thinking in those first 20 days or so, where the weather was glorious, if memory serves me right. We had a very early summer.
Yeah, there's some nice,
but out went the edict.
Opportunities for some garden parties.
Yeah, exactly.
Which were missed by most people.
Out went the edict, I think from Michael Gove, that we should stay indoors. And we should only have a set hour or so of exercise, when in fact what we needed was vitamin D. We needed exercise, and the ability to see people even from a distance would have been very beneficial. And it's probably likely, I think, I just remember reading some report article on this that said, that thousands of people needlessly died as a result of that loneliness and being sealed hermetically in their houses. It was just not good for them health-wise. And it seems so obvious, doesn't it, really, to anybody? It's a sort of grandmotherly wisdom that actually what we need to do is get out and about and get some sunshine, because that kills bugs.
Yes, and anxiety. So the CDC did some research looking at, I think it was about 500,000 people who'd been in hospital with COVID, looking at the risk factors as to what was going to lead to the worst outcomes. And I think I'm doing this from memory, but I think the biggest risk factor was obesity. But I think the second was anxiety. And so people have been propelled, people who were already prone to anxiety, that's raised, and people who had never been anxious before in their lives are now anxious. So when I read that report, I thought, all right, I'll stop worrying then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it struck me that the whole thing, I mean, I've thought this since the very beginning, the whole thing was just so intellectually facile. And from I would say that I'm sort of instinctively conservative. And so the idea, you'd associate with a philosopher like Edmund Burke, is that society grows up organically through, or if you like, a series of informal experiments, you know, and you find out what works, and then like an organism, it grows. And all right, it's not perfect, but generally speaking, people have ways of living and society has ways of operating which work, generally speaking. So if you say, right, we're going to have a lockdown, we're going to stop everything, then from that conservative perspective, for me, alarm bells were ringing immediately, even just on an instinctive level, because I was thinking, hang on a second, there are going to be consequences to this. And these consequences are going to be wide ranging and they're going to be unforeseeable. You cannot possibly understand the significance of what this is going to mean for people's lives. And of course, for people like you who study things on an academic level, which means detail, which means depth, there's a huge amount of distress because you're thinking, well, hang on a second, why has nobody thought about, for example, people with dementia? Why has nobody thought about people who are elderly and who might be suffering from isolation and loneliness? And this just goes on and on and on. I mean, something I find particularly distressing is when I hear about people who have autistic children and how lockdowns affected them. But these things were not considered because of this blunt, I mean, it's hard to think of a more blunt public policy decision, isn't it, than just everyone stay in your homes and no real consideration given to the consequences.
Yes. I mean, because you might think that even for 3 weeks at the beginning, that doesn't really matter. But actually, as we said, as a paper yesterday, even 3 weeks makes that kind of difference. But it's for blunt approaches to what actually, well, there's several things I could say, but one of them is a blunt approach to what actually counts as health. Yes. So ways of achieving it, there are risks and benefits, aren't there? So I mean, let's just take one example from work I do with dementia. But there's an understandable fear of elderly people on hospital walls having a fall, because that can have major consequences if you're elderly and you fall. Yeah. But because of that, there's often a great deal of caution about stopping people from getting out of bed. Well, then, especially the older you are, the more time you spend in bed not doing anything and not exercising, you go into a decline, you decondition really rapidly. So what I'm saying is that trying to achieve the best health is a complex of factors. It's always going to be weighing one thing off against another. But one of the things that has really struck me is the narrow conception of actually what counts as health. So we've known for a long time that health is not just physical health. We need to look at mental health as well. And even actually, there's not really a sharp divide because, you know, we're connected, because we're embodied, we're embodied creatures. Yeah. So we know, but actually the World Health Organization has got a definition of health, which then broadens that further into including social health, because you can't really separate out your own you can't separate your physical health from your mental health. You can't separate your mental health from the health of what's going on around you. And actually, I prepared my homework for here. A few years ago, I came across a definition of health, which comes from Australia, from the National Aboriginal Health Strategy Working Party in 1989, which I found really inspiring, actually, because it takes it even further still. So, I mean, most people listening will know, I mean, the health of the Aboriginal people in Australia have been treated. When I went to live in Australia, obviously I knew the situation was bad, but I was actually really taken aback at how badly the Aboriginal people have been treated, and their health status in comparison to the mainstream population is absolutely appalling. So this definition is Aboriginal health, and actually we can't quite translate the word health into Aboriginal languages because they have a much broader conception. Aboriginal health is not just the physical well-being of an individual, but is the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their full potential, thereby bringing about the total well-being of their community. It's a whole of life view and includes the cyclical concept of life, death, life. Health to Aboriginal peoples is a matter of determining all aspects of their life, including control over their physical environment, of dignity, of community self-esteem, and of justice. It's not merely a matter of a provision of doctors, hospitals, medicines, or the absence of disease and incapacity.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a wonderful.
Why is it then, Paula, do you think that governments have used such blunt instruments, such low resolution thinking, particularly conservative governments who you'd think would understand that and celebrate that kind of nuance?
I don't know who can comprehend the inner workings of Boris Johnson. Who? I don't know.
I mean, it's
mystifying, isn't it?
I think it's as much as it's. I mean, I think it's lots of things, but it's got to be an optics issue, isn't it? It's like, this is going to look bad, so therefore we have to do something about it.
Yes.
And actually, in the moment, the
Yes.
consequences,
Yes.
medium and long-term consequences, we're just not considered.
No. Well, I think possibly one of the things going on is in terms of optics, in terms of how things look, because people dying, it's a similar in the hospital wards. Somebody having a fall, you've got to report it. It's something really, really visible, but other things might be less visible. So, I mean, this is something that happens a lot in technology. Things that we can measure, the things that go into data, we get taken more notice of as well. And there are certain things that are more salient to us. So it's actually also really quite interesting then that how we make judgments.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about risk benefit and making the right decision, but how we all make judgments as human beings is going to be influenced by things. We're not rational. We're not like little machines. We weigh things in various ways. So I think possibly because the government was thinking, oh, we're going to be responsible for so and so many deaths.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why. But I mean, I actually have no idea. I mean, I really find it hard to comprehend politics, actually.
Yeah.
Why people make those decisions, I've got no idea.
Well, it's probably a good thing because it shows that your mind isn't twisted by these kind of considerations. But Paula, let's come now to the issue of the COVID-19 vaccine, the way that that's been spoken about in the public sphere. Now, you very kindly shared with me a letter that you'd written to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and we've also, I don't know whether you've seen, but we've also seen Pope Francis making comments, which I think in some ways are even more extreme, or at least even more unambiguous than the Archbishop of Canterbury's comment. I think he described taking the COVID-19 vaccination as a moral obligation for Catholics. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said before Christmas, and I think he's actually subsequently repeated this on Radio 4, that it is an act of neighbourly love to be vaccinated and to be boosted so that we can reduce the transmission of this virus and therefore protect the people around us. I'm not sure that there was much more. I think that's a fairly good summary of what he said. I don't think there's much more to it than that. Apologies if I've missed something out. I want to be fair to him. I don't want to misrepresent him, but I think that's basically what he said. Now, lots of people might hear that and think, well, yeah, that makes sense. If you're vaccinated, that reduces transmission and therefore protects people, even if you're only
Yes.
if you're only helping a small amount, why not do it? Now, you obviously have a different perspective. So do you want to sort of let us into what your perspective is and what is your reasoning?
Okay, so the interview that I'd seen reported, and then I've watched it again and made a transcript of it for the relevant bit. The thing that really got my goat was that the interviewer asked him if it was a moral issue, and he said yes, it was a moral issue. And then she was asking him, is it? I brought it with me, hang on. And she asked him something about, I've lost it now, oh my God. She asked him whether or not it would be, is it immoral not to get vaccinated? At which point, there's an opportunity to say, oh no, of course it's not immoral not to. Yeah. But it's the same rhetoric about, oh, some people might have medical reasons, but if you haven't. And it was clearly to me implied, if you said to me, is you think it's immoral to, I don't know, something, and I don't reply.
Yeah.
If I said to you, Jamie, did you eat that last slice of chocolate cake? And you refuse to answer, what am I going to conclude? So that's what I thought. I mean, maybe he needs more training in how to conduct interviews. Right. But I had a reply from Lambeth Palace to my email, not from him, obviously, because he's too busy. But the reply didn't say, oh, of course, he doesn't mean that.
Yeah, it doesn't deny it, does it?
He didn't say in the reply. He didn't take that up. So, and also I think, one of the things I think about it is that individual decisions about what to do medically are often very nuanced, or in fact, life is very complex. So it may often be the case that you think somebody hasn't made the best decision. That's not the same as saying they're immoral.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of different things that go into our decision making.
Have you heard, have you listened to Steve James, Dr. Steve James.
Oh yes, yeah.
He's done an extended interview on Unheard, which I'd recommend folks to. And you know, it's lovely to listen to, because you feel here is the best of British in terms of a doctor who can operate in a world of nuance, pastoral care, medical competency, and understands that each patient is different and autonomous. I thought it was extraordinary. I felt quite proud actually to listen to that. I thought, what a fantastic medical practitioner. Why is it that everybody isn't talking like this?
Well, yes. So that's, in a sense, that's the essence of my concerns about what's been going on. So, Jamie, you were saying a while ago, just a little while ago, you were talking about Burke and you're sort of inherently conservative and things growing up over time. So, what has happened over time, basically over the 20th century and sort of now, is understandings of medical ethics and healthcare have been developing, and developing both in law and in ethical regulation of doctors, and in things like case law, where we can gradually come to an understanding about what the relationship should be between doctors and patients, and the notion of informed consent in medicine. And it seems that as we progress, we've moved away from a paternalistic idea that the doctor knows best, and certainly away from any kind of authoritarian way of looking at things, that society or the government can tell individual people what they must do in relation to their health. And so a lot of my concerns are that we're losing that nuance. So yes, I haven't quite finished watching it, but I really enjoyed that interview. But you say, what a fantastic doctor. I would agree, but he's only doing what the General Medical Council say doctors should do in terms of individual patients. So that's one of my main concerns. Yeah. But also in terms of the Archbishop, people like the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope coming out and saying things like that, but really, really lack nuance. So that in the interview, for example, I've just complained about Justin Welby implying that people are immoral. I'm not saying I don't want to say he's immoral, but he is the Archbishop of Canterbury. So I'm giving him some constructive feedback here. He actually said he didn't really understand anti-vaxxers, didn't understand why people were not getting the vaccine. But that's the problem. He doesn't understand. He just doesn't understand.
Yeah.
So we're just helping him to understand a bit further. So but it's the clash between there's an idea that, oh, public health and everyone has got to do this, as if this is something new, and which is riding roughshod over all the last decades or the last century or so of people trying to really think about medical ethics and the practice of medicine, and gradually improve things and really be focused on patient care. And if you like, we can talk about patient autonomy, but it's really talking about respecting patients' individual decisions and understanding that a medical decision is not like something based purely on reason or based purely on technology. It's about a person, and they're very complex individual situations.
Isn't one of the problems is that having suspended that kind of Burkean idea of that everything in the end comes down not to systems but to people, and every situation is different. Every patient, every person has different needs, rather than dealing with a collective. That what we have had, maybe in the last sort of 10, 20 years, particularly, this has been brewing in the background, is this more kind of digital, clunky view of reality, which is everything can be reduced to zeros and ones, and likewise people and systems, and we're sort of consumers trapped in a sort of collectivism, really. That I was struck recently how a number of articles have picked up on that authoritarian states often begin with healthcare scares. That cleanliness on a ground, or that there are a group of people who are particularly unclean or should be unwelcome in the social sphere, and that this is sort of, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it has these rhymes.
Yes, but actually, new technology is often pushed by focusing on medical benefits. Or it's so, for example, you know, Elon Musk's mad idea about these neural link implants in your brain. That's pushed through saying, of course, it could be of great benefit to people who are paraplegic, for example, which it could be. But you over and over and over again, you'll see that that technology is pushed by saying these health benefits are overriding. Yeah. But also, so one of my concerns is that what's happening and what's been happening over the last 2 years is that significant changes in the relationship between the NHS or the medical profession as a whole and individual patients are being brought in, but really would need to have, if we're going to make these changes, they need to have great public debate and discussion. So, I mean, to underline it, just to prove that it's not like me saying this, because I've an academic done my homework, I have brought along, so for example, some guidance from guidance about informed consent and getting informed consent from patients emphasises that this applies to all healthcare decisions, including vaccinations. So this is from the General Medical Council. How should doctors seek an adult patient's consent for vaccine? This is about COVID-19 in particular. Doctors must be satisfied they have consent or other valid authority before they provide treatment to patients. Our expectations are the same before they administer vaccines. So it's not a special case. We can't sort of say, oh, you've got to have it for the benefit of other people. That's against General Medical Council guidelines. And in fact, in particular, guidance about decision making in terms of children, vaccinations are seen to be, where is it? I've lost it. Here we are. Vaccinations childhood vaccinations come under a special category of a small group of important decisions. So if parents disagree about something, so for example, in terms of non-medical circumcision, if there's a disagreement, or vaccination, if there's a disagreement, it's not to say, oh, well, the default is vaccination. It's a small group of important decisions where if there's disagreement between the parents, it has to go before the courts. So I just want to emphasize that in terms of saying, what's happening now is that, oh, vaccinations, oh, never mind, it's just a vaccination, just have it. It's quite a significant change to be going down that route.
So, Paula, I mean, to return to the Archbishop's comments and the sort of broader context, I think what you say about him saying he doesn't understand, I think that's potentially the most significant thing about his comments. And I'll just put this out there. So he is the head, however you understand that, of the Anglican Church. So 80 million Anglicans. He's got immense spiritual significance as a Christian leader. Now, it seems to me that there is something, and I want to choose my words carefully here, but it seems to me that there's something verging on abusive to say to people, you must have a vaccination in order to protect other people. And the reason it, particularly when he's saying he doesn't understand what their reasons are. And the reason, well, one of the reasons I think is that the vast majority of people who are not being vaccinated because they have done a risk-benefit calculation in their own minds, and they feel that for themselves, they believe that for themselves, that the vaccine may pose a greater risk to them than COVID-19. And that's, I mean, it's just cards on the table. That's my basic reason. I have other things I could add to that, but that would be my basic, that's where my starting point would be. If somebody asked me, why are you not vaccinated? It's because I know I've been on the Oxford University website and I've done their risk calculation, and I have something like a 1 in 150,000 chance of dying from COVID-19. I imagine it's even less now with the Omicron variant. And I am not confident that my risk of death or injury from the vaccine is better than that. In fact, I suspect it's very much worse. So that's my reason, right? So if somebody then comes to me, especially a spiritual leader, and says, you must be vaccinated, I'm thinking, hang on a second, you're telling me to do something that I consider to be dangerous to myself in order to get this tiny net benefit for ostensibly for the people around me. Now that's what it means to be loving. But I'm thinking, hang on a second, you're not being loving towards me.
Yes, that's what I thought. Yes,
because you're not taking into account my concerns about my health.
Yes.
So this is an inconsistent viewpoint.
Yes,
Go on.
That's one that could be weaponized easily.
Yes.
What the Archbishop of Canterbury says.
Yes.
So, you're only there a few steps away, aren't you, from, though he hasn't said this, others sort of picking up on that and riding with that and saying, well, you're despicable then.
Yeah. Because you won't put yourself in harm's way. You're immoral because you won't take what you consider to be a risk for the benefit of other people. That's essentially what the implication. Yes,
that is the implication. So I'm sure I know there are people who have taken the vaccine because of other people, because they think it's a benefit. So if you like, that is a neighbourly thing to do. But as you're right, it's not being neighbourly to the people who have got reasons for not taking it. It's not being neighbourly. So if we take this sort of mythical, crazy anti-vaxxer, let's suppose there is a crazy anti-vaxxer out there. Supposing they are literally crazy, whatever that means. Is it neighbourly? Is it neighbourly to tell them that they're immoral? So supposing somebody is an anti-vaxxer because they're frightened that the state is going to force them into having a vaccine.
Yeah.
What do you do with that person? Force them to have a vaccine? Yeah. And they're right. So it is a lack of compassion, but also in terms of there's medical law, which is really clearly on the side of the patients, I would say, in terms of free and informed consent. And there's ethical regulations for doctors, but law only operates against a certain background.
Yeah.
And in particular, for the law on consent, there's two elements. It's got to be free and informed. So in terms of the level of information, how that's gone, the level of information that you have to provide for a patient is actually, the standards are actually really pretty high. So ordinarily, obviously it depends on the circumstances, pragmatics. If you go along, if you're knocked unconscious and taken into hospital with in a road traffic accident, they just treat you straight away. It's an emergency. Or for certain routine things, they wouldn't go into all the ins and outs. And the standard of information has got to be matched with what the patient is concerned about. And you mentioned doing a risk benefit of your particular risk of dying of COVID versus vaccine. But of course, that's completely and utterly valid for individual circumstances. That would be the sort of thing you'd have to provide to patients. But when doctors have to provide informed, make certain that patients are actually informed about it, they have to make certain that they understand what the patient's own particular values and beliefs are.
Yeah.
Which is more than just values about your health.
Yeah. How much then is a break from medical ethics tradition, where countries like, I think Greece has introduced €100 a month fine to those who are unjabbed over the age of 50, and so on and so on. It seems like the European Union and parts of America and Australia. In China, it's a completely different ball game, where you're just completely ostracized from society if you don't do this. But how much of a break is it from the tradition of medical ethics to actually fine people for not taking this?
Well, it's horrific. It's just complete. It's a complete and utter break, because I have no idea what the medical ethics situation is in Greece, but it's a complete and utter break. And also, it's a slippery slope, isn't it? When people use slippery slope arguments, they're often poo-pooed, but as if, that will never happen, or scaremongering. No. But slippery slopes exist. We can point to them. It's science that slippery slopes happen. And if you're talking about the vaccine, what's next? Obesity, not eating your 5 a day.
Yeah. Smoking has just been banned in New Zealand for certain age groups, hasn't it? So there's an age group beyond, if you were born after a certain date, you will never be allowed to smoke in your life in New Zealand.
Maybe you want to take it up.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to take it up. Yeah. Oh, alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about, they're going to be banning communion wine next? You're going to have Ribena instead.
Yep, exactly. So let me bring it on to something related. The Archbishop, after he made those comments about, he doesn't understand the quote unquote anti-vaxxers, he then said, when he was asked about his reasoning or what he would say to these people, it was essentially, I'm not a scientist, so I trust the scientists. And you should trust the scientists as well, which really, I think in some ways is a very insightful comment, because what it indicates, what it illustrates, I think rightly, is that this really, for the vast majority of people, is an issue of trust. It's about who do you trust, right? Yeah. And you might say, I trust the scientists, but this is a weakness, I think, in his argument, because you can't lend your own trust to other people. So, okay, Archbishop, you might trust the scientists, you might trust Big Pharma, but I don't. So what are we going to do about that? You know, you can't just tell me, I can't conjure up trust out of nowhere because you have it.
Yeah, I totally sympathize with that. I mean, I and I've mentioned this before in this podcast, as a teenager, had an extreme allergic reaction to an antibiotic, which ends up that I'm allergic to a whole set and possibly other sort of various substances. So, you know, it's at 14, if you've spent a month in bed,
yes,
and you then subsequently hear that you know, half a dozen people die with similar allergies every year in this country, that parliamentary debate gets nowhere, that pharmaceuticals are still selling this, that in fact, you know, some of these antibiotics are given willy-nilly in ICU intravenously, which would finish me off within about an hour. That doesn't give you confidence. You know, I struggled to, having had my eyes open to that debate over the last 30 years, I've found that somewhat chilling. So I find myself very skeptical, really, and you know, scientific pride and vanity can also, and money can push people and organizations to do things not always to the benefit of the patient.
Yes, so I completely agree. It's a really good point, JB, about you can't tell somebody to trust. You can't swap it around. It's not a commodity like that. But also, trusting the science is such an incredibly stupid thing to say, because I mean, science is always developing, but also medical science is, human bodies are unbelievably complex things. And we know that there are problems in science with issues about replication. There's a replication crisis. We know that you might get findings in a study and another study shows there's sort of greater nuance, or we got it all wrong. You also know, you also see that there are groups of scientists who have different opinions about it. So when we look, for example, at the data, the use of statistics and so on to interpret the data and understand what's going on, it's incredibly complex. So you might get people who genuinely disagree what the data actually means. I remember this when this really struck home to me when I was in. I used to go to weekly seminars in the medical science division at Oxford, and there was one seminar in particular about routine use of mammograms for breast screening in older women. And it just really struck me that there was an Oxford group who thought that they were really beneficial for women of a certain age group, and then people from Cambridge who were more skeptical of what we did more harm than good. I think that these are all genuine, high-notch scientists. But it's like the Oxford people tended to think one thing, and the Cambridge people tended to think another. So it's not as if they're doing anything wrong, but how you view these and interpret them. So when Welby was talking, he trusts the science. What science? What about those people who've been sort of banned from? Who was it? That chap from I forgot their names. You mean who was banned from Twitter and so on?
Oh, Robert Malone. I mean, he was.
Yes, and the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford.
Oh, well, that's his name will come to me in a minute.
Yes.
I know who you mean.
Yeah.
What was it, Daniel?
Carl Hennigan?
Carl Hennigan, that's it.
Yeah. But also the other thing you made a point when you talk, Daniel, when you're talking about, well, 2 points. One, in terms of your personal experience, if you've had personal experiences, it's like, okay, aeroplanes are the safest form of travel. But if you have been in an air crash and survived, you might never want to go in an aeroplane again.
Yeah.
And
so, Paula, can I ask you about this? Because I mean, say how much you're comfortable with, but from my perspective, so the reason, so when I said that thing about trust, for me, I'm happy to trust sort of individual doctors, but I have to say that I'm very, very skeptical about the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And this is something that I've only really started to read about over the past couple of years because I wanted to inform myself. But it seems there are a number of things which are massive warning, like big alarm bells in my mind. One of them is the censorship issue. It seems to me that the pharmaceutical industry have a huge amount of influence in social media, in technology companies, and in the corporate media, and that the policy has been to censor, and you wrote this in your letter, to censor information that might cause so-called vaccine hesitancy, even if the information is true.
Yes.
Even if they know it's true,
yes.
if in their mind it's going to lead to a psychological problem for people vis-a-vis taking the vaccine, they will censor that information. So for me, that's not something which cultivates trust, right? If you say, no, actually, you know what? You're going to take this vaccine and I'm going to withhold information. So essentially they're withholding the possibility of informed consent then, because they're actually taking away your opportunity to be informed. And then there are various other things, like the way that I don't believe the pharmaceutical companies are upfront about injuries from pharmaceutical products. And I think that this is a major issue. And when I look at the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, I think, well, we've got the yellow card system in the UK, we've got the VAERS system in America. These systems are we all know that they're flawed. And so if they are this flawed, how will we even know if this vaccine or this set of vaccines, how would we even know if they are injuring people and if they are safe? And yet we're being told over and over again that they are safe. In some cases, you've got people saying like these vaccines are 100% safe. Children, for example, I was just reading today, all of this kind of stuff. Added to that, the fact that the pharmaceutical industry it has legal indemnity from injuries from these vaccines, and as you write again, it's very, very hard to sue the pharmaceutical industry. So they've got very little accountability financially. To me, I'm trying to convey that in my mind there are a constellation of issues here which cause me serious alarm.
Yes, you're quite right. So when they're talking about trusting the science, it makes it sound like they're just like totally disembodied, disinterested people just doing science in a lab somewhere. But the pharmaceutical industry is an industry. It's incredibly expensive to develop drugs. It's incredibly expensive to bring them to, and they're selling them. They're commercial industries, and the history of the pharmaceutical industry is absolutely appalling. It's absolutely appalling. I also want to say that actually, even a lot of people are skeptical and may fail to have trust because they've seen that even abuses in medicine, like testing things without proper ethical guidance, or going and testing drugs in Africa and India because the ethics guidance is less than it. We know that happens. But the pharmaceutical industry is known to have taken part in all sorts of really dodgy practices, including, for example, not publishing negative results. So I actually grabbed some books off my bookcase. This book here, The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It. It sounds like it's written by some crazy anti-science person, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Written by Marcia Angel, MD, former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine.
Right.
So
a crazy anti-vaxxer, obviously.
Yes. And so, so the reason why we have the yellow card report, the reason why we have that system is because of drug companies withholding information, but also because of the fact you test something in a clinical trial and you need to carry on monitoring it for years before you know whether or not what all the results are. So that's why we have the system. And in terms of trust for pharmaceuticals, in common with millions and millions of other people, I was prescribed antidepressants, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. I was only on it for about 6 months, but in common with a significant minority of people, I had absolutely horrific problems trying to come off it. it would take too long to tell you all the side effects I had, but I had to taper off it really, really slowly. And for the best part of 20 years, I was part of a class action case trying to sue the drug company that made this particular antidepressant, which basically failed on a technicality. I won't go into all the details. So I have seen firsthand how there were scientists on our side validating that this particular antidepressant had a particular problem with withdrawal effects. I did an LLM in medical law and did a dissertation about litigation against pharmaceutical companies. Meanwhile, because I was on the steering committee for this group, I know that for exactly the same issues, the same pharmaceutical company was making out-of-court settlements up to millions of dollars with individuals in the United States. But because the law's different over here, they didn't. But also because these are out-of-court settlements, nobody knows about them because you have to sign a non-disclosure.
Isn't it? And isn't it strange how only up to a couple of years ago, you could make a good movie or documentary on how many people in, say, the United States are hooked to prescribed drugs.
Yes.
And how no one seemed to have the will, whether politicians, pharmaceuticals, to actually do anything about this. And that this was becoming a sort of mental health pandemic. I mean, I watched horrific videos of people who are on mainstream antidepressant drugs, painkillers, and are totally hooked on this. And this has been normalized. And it's funny how that discussion suddenly gone all silent. There's radio silence on that in the last couple of years.
Yes. Yeah.
We're employing the same people who've screwed half of America. Well, never mind.
Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say another film worth mentioning as well is the Dallas Buyers Club. If you've ever seen that film, which is it's extraordinary to my mind that this film was actually made, but it chronicles the suppression of life-saving treatment for HIV sufferers because the pharmaceutical companies were trying to market test and market a toxic lethal medication called AZT.
Yes,
it's extraordinary.
Yes, it is extraordinary. So I mean, actually, there's so much. There are so many aspects to this that we could go on talking for a long time. But I just one of the things to note as well in relation to this is even how, which comes up a lot. It sprung to mind talking about things like antidepressants. Is how we even think about disease, what model of disease we have, and what model of disease and health we have. And so obviously there's a lot of talk about, which seems to have dropped out of the picture, the notion of medicalization, about whether or not we go down a route where we take pharmaceuticals, go down a route of having as many vaccines as possible and all the rest of it, versus different ways of trying to approach this. So that's part of some of the reasons why people are hesitant to get the vaccine, because if they'd rather rely on getting their own health. So that's a perfectly valid reason. So one of the things to point out in terms of how the medical law in this country stands, you have the legal right to refuse medical treatment for any reason or for none. You don't have to give a reason. And the doctors have to respect that. So for GMC, you give guidelines what to do if you disagree with the patient decision. You still have to respect it. You might need to give them more information and make certain that they're informed.
You would ban them from the cinema.
Yeah. But so in that unheard interview, Freddie Sayers kept on saying, "Oh, shouldn't people be encouraged? Shouldn't older people be encouraged to get the vaccine?" Depends what you mean by encouragement. Give them the information. They should be given the information. Yeah. But encourage them is actually sort of coercion. So the steps that doctors are supposed to take to prevent coercion are really, really quite great. So, for example, if you go along to the doctors with somebody else and you think that your mother or whoever it is trying to push you in one direction, then you're supposed to see the patient on their own to check they're not being coerced. And I've worked with doctors who are concerned that the very fact that you're practicing in a hospital is sort of implying that therefore medical treatment is the best thing to do. So it's specified that one of the options that patients should be told, the option of doing nothing. So
Well, again, that was very pertinent, wasn't it? Again, a few years ago, I remember Michael Mosley's series about how we've all got hooked onto antibiotics, and there were all these sort of discrete webcam fly on the wall pictures of people going into the GPs, and essentially the GP thing is the easiest thing to do is just say, oh, we'll have an antibiotic, when they don't need it. And what they actually needed was really rest, hot drink with lemon. And I think they found that even when people were offered lemons, honey, and a box set DVDs, they were still sort of, well, you sure I don't need the antibiotic? No, you don't have a viral infection, you don't have a bacterial infection, you don't need this. And this will have an overall negative impact on our ability as humans to deal with serious infection if we over apply antibiotics. And I find it extraordinary that on the grander scale of things, we're now using vaccination in a manner that we would never use antibiotics 2-3 years ago.
Yes. So I'm just thinking about, there's so many different things to say when I'm trying to get backtrack and thinking about that Archbishop's.
Oh, dear Archbishop.
Thing. But yeah, so but that point about overuse of vaccines, who is it who's just come out and said that we can't keep on vaccinating indefinitely, we can't keep on doing it, it has an impact on your immune system? And so one of the points that Steve James was saying is in terms of like long-term data, so people might get counted as anti-vax if their position is, my own particular risk is fairly low, and I might have the vaccine when there's more data has come in, because one of the things at which people vary in terms of what risks they want is how wary they are about novelty. So you might be offered a new drug which looks like it might have a better profile than the one you're on. You might say, oh, I'll have the one I'm on because it's been around for a long time. Or the other person might think, oh, I'll have the new one. You can't say one's right and one's wrong. So people vary in terms of how much they're prepared to do for novelty, but also there's no right answer about the risk because it is unknown. One of the things doctors are supposed to do is to talk about the level of uncertainty. So one of the things that we've never done before is give people a booster vaccination of the same vaccine every 2 months indefinitely, which is one of the things that seems to be suggesting we haven't done it. So to think that you're an anti-vaxxer, if you think, is this loving my neighbour?
Yeah. Well, this is the problem I have, is like the coercion, like the coercive language, the othering. If you're, and this is the thing, I think that people, when they make comments like the Archbishop of Canterbury did, they're not helping the conversation because they're not addressing people's concerns. Like I've said, like I've tried to outline my concerns about, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, and I know that the reaction in lots of people's minds will just be, you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist, you're just an anti-vaxxer, etc., etc. And I don't know what to do with that, because all I can say is, no, I've read books, I've read articles, I've watched films, I've watched documentaries, and I know this stuff is going on. And I can't just act like I don't, and then, as I say, just go ahead and trust these people. So all I'm saying is, all right, you might totally disagree with me. You might think that I'm completely mischaracterizing the pharmaceutical industry. But if you want to convince me, you have to deal with my concerns. You can't act like they don't exist.
Yes, you have to. So we're talking about conspiracy theory. It's just such a terrible label. It makes it sound as if there's never been any conspiracies. They're not conspiracy theory. If you think that the pharmaceutical industry has in the past behaved atrociously, you're not a conspiracy theorist. You're a conspiracy factist.
Yeah, I mean, you can go on Google and look. You can go up on Google and look and type in pharmaceutical litigation.
Yeah,
and the numbers are eye-watering.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important point, is that, well, as far as I'm concerned anyway, is that if this conversation is in any way going to become a credible conversation, then the people who are not being vaccinated need to be understood
Yes.
Concerns need to be addressed, and we can't have this situation where you're not allowed to say anything beyond a kind of prescribed narrow band of things. And if you do, then you are labelled a conspiracy theorist or an anti-vaxxer. It's just. I mean, it's not going to do anything. All it's going to do is drive division. And for from a spiritual perspective, from the perspective of a churchman, surely what we want to do is we want to discourage division and ostracization, and we want to bring people together. And the great, to my mind, the great liberal tradition of our culture is to encourage adversarial conversation. Our law courts are based around that principle. Our parliament is literally set out in an adversarial position so that both sides of an issue can be heard. And I think, this is something we need to rediscover, because the road we're going down at the moment is,
well, the Church of England, Church of England is supposedly one of its on the tin sales pitches it's this great intellectual establishment that supposedly allows for an enormous amount of diversity of opinion, and yet no comment, Daniel. On medical, on these and many other issues, particularly this medical issue, we've got no nuance. And there's no space. I mean, I suspect there are clergy who are terrified of putting their head above the parapet on this, and the Archbishop has just made that 10 times worse. There are people who say, well, if vicar so and so is not vaxxed, maybe I shouldn't receive Holy Communion from them because A, they're immoral, and B, they might be medically infectious.
Yes. There's such lack of nuance and such lack of debate. And also, even about if you express any skepticism about the vaccines, or you say you haven't been vaccinated, there's always an assumption that you are, you then fall into the crazy totally against it. So I mean, just take the example. I'm very, very skeptical about the use of antidepressants, but I wouldn't ever say to people that people forget that depression can be a really life-threatening illness, and that some people have benefited from them. I just want more information, and I want them more nuanced, and I want more caution about their use. I'm not anti-medication. No. I just want a more global. It's the same with I've been vaccinated up to my eyeballs. I've had every childhood vaccination. I've had vaccinations for traveling to sort of Asia and so on. But I'd make a different decision about this. I also had, I did actually have, when I was in my 20s, I had an incredibly bad reaction to the TB vaccination. I was ill for years. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a bit skeptical, because I never really got a satisfactory answer from the doctors treating me exactly what was going on. I had to take TB medication for 10 months in the end, and I was incredibly ill for most of my early 20s. Never really got an answer. But that's not mean to say that makes me more cautious, but I'm not anti-vaccine. I'm not anti-doctors in general.
I'm not really sure what an anti-vaxxer even is, to be honest with you. I mean, it seems to be a kind of sort of bogeyman type creation. I mean, it's ostensibly somebody who is completely scientifically illiterate, who just for some reason refuses all vaccines and won't, and wants to kind of spread this kind of ideology, this kind of anti-vaccine idea. I mean, honestly, I've never met a single person like that in my life. And the people I know about now who are skeptical about vaccination have very good reasons for being skeptical. And as I say, just calling people anti-vaxxers does absolutely nothing to the conversation or help in any way. But we probably need to wrap things up in a minute.
Yes.
Let me give you an opportunity. I mean, have you got any sort of parting thoughts or anything that you feel like you haven't said, which you want to get off your chest, or anything at all to as a final thing to say?
Well, I suppose there's lots more things that I could say, but just as a final thing, if you're going to, the main message is the problem about how a sort of very blunt public health message about getting vaccinated and trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible, plus the government's nudge unit and so on and so forth, has been translated into driving a sort of coach and horses through ideas about treating people as individuals, and with respect on whatever on whatever position you want to take. So I do want to stress, there'll be people listening to this who've been vaccinated. Make your own personal decision. Make your own personal decision. But really, really, please do not. This could be seen as an absolutely terrible opportunity to totally undermine many people's trust in the medical profession and in the government and divide us in society. That's the very, very last thing that we want, the very, very last thing we need, because that is how the fact that we've been living such isolated lives, some more than others, in the last 2 years, it's absolutely devastating on mental health, devastating for society. So we should just treat people with respect and understand that they've got good reasons for doing. And also, actually, lastly, even if there are some crazy anti-vaxxers out there, can't we as a society accommodate them as well? We allowed conscientious objection in the Second World War. But when we've talked about vaccination before, we've never wanted every single person. We've always allowed, but some people would turn it down.
Yeah.
I would add to that considering the Archbishop's comments, isn't our sort of constructive criticism that particularly the bishops need to come into some of these spaces and have an open discussion, an open, deep intellectual discussion, thrash it out, rather than just seemingly go along with the crowd on this, and to be seen to be understanding. That is good counselling practice. And if the church isn't doing that, Archbishop, come on to our podcast with.
In all seriousness, Daniel,
and actually have this discussion.
If there are bishops listening to this, or if there are, as I know that there are senior people in the church who listen to this, or if there are people who know bishops personally and want to invite them on the show to talk about this issue, to have a proper dialogue, we will do that. We will facilitate a proper, respectful dialogue. If anyone, any bishop, is willing to have such a conversation with us, that's an open offer, serious, genuine offer. As I say, I think we've been going now for a couple of hours. I'm sure people are loving this, but we always want to leave people hungry for more. So I think we should probably wrap things up. Before, Daniel, I'll ask you to give us a blessing or something to finish off. But before we do that, I just want to say thank you so much, Paula, for your time and your insight and your courage and willingness to speak up on these issues, which they're difficult issues to talk about in public. There is always the fear that there will be backlash and difficulty as a result of raising these concerns. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been interesting and fun.
Yes, so it's been brilliant to have you. Thank you to all our listeners for being with us today. I won't repeat all the notices, but do connect with us in the ways that I mentioned at the top of the episode. Particularly join our Telegram group, follow us on Twitter. If you'd like to sponsor the show, you can do so on patreon.com/irreverends. Daniel, could you finish us off with some kind of deeply spiritual blessing or the equivalent?
Yeah, of course. I can't find it at the moment. I was just trying to Google it, but in the dark comedy "Don't Look Up," Timothy Chalamet has a wonderful prayer as the comet's about to strike Earth, calling himself a secret evangelical, and the family are having a Thanksgiving meal. But I'll have to see if I can find that prayer and give it to another time. But it's a prayer about hope for the future for humanity. But a similar epiphany-tide prayer then, and a blessing for us all. May God, the Son of righteousness, may his light dawn upon us all as we look to this new year. May each of us know his love and his light now and forevermore. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with us and remain with us evermore. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you once again, Paula. Thank you, Daniel, as always, for your time. And thank you to everyone for listening. We will be with you again next week.